Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Today's podcast is the second of 4 on pathological gambling, and we're going to talk about treatment basics for clinicians who work with pathological gamblers. We'll start with a quick overview of crisis intervention, and then move to some of the techniques and rationales behind behavioral and cognitive treatments. These are brief theoretical overviews. If you're interested in a more in-depth discussion of these approaches, you can find the individual podcasts on those subjects at socialworkpodcast.com. We'll end with a discussion of some of the challenges that clinicians often encounter when working with pathological gamblers. Now, quick disclaimer, this podcast is intended to be a general overview of treatment approaches rather than a clinical training. If you're currently working with or intend to work with people with gambling addiction, proper education and training is essential. In the 4th part of this series, Jody and I talk about some of the requirements for obtaining the NCGC-1, the National Certified Gambling Counselor Certification. That podcast, as with all the others, is available on our website, socialworkpodcast.com. And now, on to the interview. Jody, why is it important for someone who works with pathological gamblers to know about crisis intervention?
Usually when a gambler or a family member of a gambler makes the phone call to you, it's because they're in a state of crisis or something's happened within the past 24 hours, precipitating the need to call for help. Typically, it presents itself in that phone call. So I just wanted to briefly cover that because you don't think of it all the time that someone's in crisis when they're calling for help. You think that they're maybe possibly relieved that they've made the phone call. When a gambler calls and says, I really need help, I got your name from the gambling hotline, or I talked with someone who gave me your name, I always ask, and what happened recently that made you want to call me today? They might say that they've realized they've spent $12,000, that their parents are about to find out, their spouse found out in the last 24 hours, something like that. You want to find out what was the crisis that precipitated the phone call.
I think that's a really important point to make because with any crisis, whether it's pathological gambling or it's crisis of suicide, any sort of crisis, one of the key definitions is that it is something that has just happened. And you can distinguish this from something that would be chronic, for example. So you really want to find out what happened in the last 24 hours, what happened a couple hours ago, why today as opposed to yesterday.
Great. And when someone's calling on the phone, you also want to employ a couple techniques before they actually meet with you when you give them an appointment. Your window of opportunity is very, very narrow with this population when they first call. So typically 48 hours is all you want to wait before giving them an appointment time. In between that time, that 24 to 48 hours, ask them if anyone knows about their gambling problem, if they've shared that with anyone, that they can call and ask for help, that they can stay with them until they've made it to the therapy session, because you don't want them to go back out and start gambling again, which is their typical coping skill.
To prevent it from getting worse, escalating. Getting
worse, and you want them to show up for the appointment. So that's the 2 pieces. You want to make sure that they don't get so nervous and they can't handle the crisis state that they resort back to their old behaviors. You want them to show up. You want to encourage them. Thank you so much for calling. I can get you in within 48 hours. Do you have someone that can help stay with you, someone that knows about your problems so that you don't feel tempted to go out and gamble again until I can see you?
And that's so important because crisis state is also characterized by typical coping, not actually being able to help resolve the problem. And in a gambling situation, somebody's typical coping would be to gamble more.
Absolutely. They want to go out and chase the big win to get them out of their problems as they see it that caused the crisis. The next thing to understand when treating this population is that research has shown the most effective treatment is a combination of both cognitive behavioral as well as behavioral techniques and therapy. So I'll give you a brief overview, not necessarily in exactly a step-by-step process that someone might see you for services and seek treatment, but just to better understand the behavioral component and the cognitive behavioral component in treating pathological gamblers.
And so this isn't necessarily what you would do while the person is in crisis. This is after the crisis has been resolved correct?
Correct. It's after they've shown for their appointment. Where do you start? Where do you go from there?
Okay, so they're actually in your office.
They're in your office.
All right.
You work on all of the therapeutic alliance techniques, the engagement, all of those calm and social work concepts. And then you look at motivational enhancement. First thing I like to talk about is to better understand what does the client want to accomplish now that they're with you. Get a better understanding of how internally motivated they are, how externally motivated they are. Most often, they will have some external motivation, a partner, a spouse, family member, employment, legal involvement. Something's going to be external, but you also want to better understand internal motivation. So that's usually typically something I would really tap into early on, and it helps with the engagement process.
Because the internal motivation, that's what keeps people around.
Absolutely. When the tough get going, if they're more internally motivated, they'll hang in there and make it through.
And so what would be an example of an internal motivation for someone in general, or maybe somebody who's a pathological gambler specifically?
It could be anything as simple as, I have a wife and kids at home. I want to do this for them. I want to be a better husband. I want to be a better father. It can be that they're just very exhausted with the lifestyle, and they know that they want something better, and they can have something better. They just don't know how to get it.
So we're going to talk first about the behavior therapy, right? And so there's some basic concepts we should go over in terms of behavior therapy when we talk about this. And the most basic concept that we have in behavior therapy is this idea of reinforcement and punishment.
Absolutely. What I like to look at in terms of, we understand basic concepts of reinforcement and punishment, but how does that relate to the gambler? The positive reinforcement or the negative reinforcement. There's individuals that when they first learned how to gamble, whether it was $5, $20 in a slot machine, a poker machine, they gambled and it took their money and they lost. And they said, well, this isn't any fun. I don't like this. Why would I keep giving this machine my money? So that's an example of giving something and getting punished for it, not getting anything in return. Another individual might put $20 into a machine the very first time, and they hit for $500. And they say, this is amazing. This is the best thing ever. I love this kind of gambling. I love these odds. I like to play this. So they had a reinforcement of their behavior. So talking with the gambler, you want to find out what their early experiences were in gambling, because you can easily identify them as being reinforced in a positive way that caused them to want to keep gambling. So they gambled and won, and then as they continue this behavior, track and find out who helped them out. And what I mean by that is they all of a sudden experienced negative punishment. They gambled and they lost money and lost money and lost money, and then someone came along and bailed them out. It can be as simple as, you were young, I'm going to pay off all your debt because you didn't understand what you were doing. I'm going to start you with a clean slate because I know you won't get into trouble again. So someone bailed that person out. Or they realized they gambled a lot of money away, and mom or dad, regardless if they're already grown adults, mom and dad came and gave them a bunch of money again to get them out of their tough situation. So it was reinforced that when you get into trouble, someone's going to help you, which then reinforces continued gambling behavior.
So there's this idea that behavior continues because of punishment or reinforcement.
Absolutely.
And so it's not that you're doing a traditional psychodynamic, let's look at your childhood, your relationship to your mother, but when you look in the past, you're looking for those moments where the person was either reinforced or punished for gambling, and to find out what that looked like.
Yes. When you do further research with behavioral therapy, you know that the most powerful punishment reinforcement for an individual is the intermittent rewards, which is exactly what gambling does. You don't win every time. So you keep playing because you know the next time you might win. So it's intermittent reinforcement that keeps the behavior going. The next thing that I look at is when an individual does want to stop gambling, They don't always know the solutions. So we kind of go over, again, some behavioral interventions, things like exposure to gambling. What happens if they find themselves near a gambling establishment? This is where you get them to think and have a plan before they leave the house or before they leave work. Take a different way to work, drive home a different way. Don't accept invitations from friends to go gamble. And a very obvious one, but you don't think of very often, is explore where they typically go on vacation, because they're going to need to change their vacation destinations. It could be that they like to go on cruises. Cruises always have casinos, and you're always on the boat. It could be that they like to go to Atlantic City. They like to go to Las Vegas. So you have to have that conversation with them about how to avoid the gambling establishments. Seems very basic, and yet that's what behavioral interventions are. Very basic. When we talk about their financial situation, it's not just do they have cash in their pocket or do they not have cash in their pocket. It's how do you keep them from gambling in the future? What are some safeguards you can put into place? So you ask them to cancel all their credit cards. They don't have a debit card. They can't go to the debit machine or get cash back when they go to purchase something. They have limited access to the bank, maybe require double signatures in order to do any withdrawals. They have automatic deposit of their paycheck. They have someone else get and open all their mail.
Now, why would you have somebody get and open their mail? I mean, everything else seems to make sense, but what is it about the mail?
Most people would think, oh, it's because you don't want them to have to open all those overdue notices. It's too hard for them. That's not what this is. Think in today's society where if you don't have cash, you have another means to get anything you want instantly. You are pre-approved for $25,000 credit card, cash advance, anything like that. They're coming in the mail to people all the time. So when you have someone else open the mail, you get to weed out all of those instant access to more cash, to more money, so that the gambler doesn't see it, to even be triggered by it.
Clearly a behavioral intervention, because you're not talking about, well, what's your emotional experience of these things? What is it that it reminds you of? You're simply saying, here's a behavior that you can stop.
Absolutely.
Beautiful.
Again, very simple techniques that anyone else around the gambler can help support in doing, where they're not enabling further gambling behavior.
When you say enabling, what do you mean?
Helping them to continue to gamble and get into trouble.
Okay, and this would be something that somebody would do because they think they're helping?
Right. They think they're helping, just like bailout. Bailing out someone and paying off all their debt, you think you're helping them, but all you're doing is relieving the pressure of poor choices and poor consequences, which doesn't make the individual feel the consequences of their choices, so they're more likely to continue the same behavior.
Now, the punishment doesn't happen.
Absolutely.
There's almost a reward for blowing all your money because somebody else is going to bail you out.
Exactly. It all comes full circle when you understand punishment and reward with the family members, support member, enabling, putting into place techniques, all of that. The last thing I like to look at is free time. When someone stops gambling, they never realized how much free time they had. They typically would gamble either to escape or to have some sort of stimulation, high-risk activation going on. When you take away the gambling, they have a lot more free time. You need to help them with what to do with their free time. Sometimes it also involves looking at consuming alcohol and or drugs, because they will substitute their free time with drinking. Then the drinking causes them to reduce their inhibitions and willpower to resist gambling. So you kind of look at those together if the individual does tend to consume alcohol and or use drugs.
So those behavioral interventions seem to be really, as you said, very, very simple. Not necessarily easy to do, but they're very basic. At what point do you then go to cognitive interventions, or sort of the cognitive behavioral treatment?
You entertain cognitive behavioral treatment when the individual better understands their gambling behavior. So it's a little bit different for each individual. You'll know when you're working with your client. But this is the point where you start to get them to cognitively address what's going on in their mind that then results in a behavior. First example that I do is called a gambler's passion. I just draw a circle on a piece of paper. I have the individual fill in. I say, this is your life. How much does your gambling take up in your life? And they'll fill in maybe half, maybe a quarter, and if they're really honest, maybe 3/4, and say, it's really starting to fill up my universe. That helps them to visualize and cognitively understand how much time they really do spend doing that. I also spend time cognitively going over the concepts of chance versus skill. And you can hear about that in my other podcast where I give you a more in-depth explanation of chance versus skill when treating this population. The classic ABCD of cognitive behavioral therapy: situation, automatic thought, behavior, consequence. You can spend a lot of time with each individual with this ABCD concept. An example would be, I get my paycheck. That's the situation. I tell myself I can gamble a small part of this money and come out ahead. I gamble more than I planned and I lose more than I can afford. I feel upset and guilty. The trap: gambling helps me come out ahead. And you can process all of these different automatic thoughts and situations to break it down to the CBT concepts. At some point, you need to also look at relapse prevention. If they've been able to cut back on their gambling, or as I've talked about in an earlier podcast, the concept of harm reduction versus abstinence, then you need to then address relapse prevention with them. What are the warning signs? What would be a slip versus a relapse, depending on the region that you live in, depending on the GA meeting or the other types of interventions you're using. They might talk about a slip versus a relapse. A slip would be that they went to a nonprofit fundraiser and they had no idea that everything was about buying raffle tickets. So to them, that was a slip, as opposed to, I drove to the casino and I started gambling again.
So we've talked about the basics of behavior treatment. We've talked about cognitive intervention, specifically looking at the thoughts and the way that people process information that might lead them either to gamble or to stay away from gambling situations.
Right. With the concepts of CBT is to look at distorted thoughts, faulty thinking, change those thoughts, which will then change the behavior. You spend a lot of time in your sessions on CBT. They're very unique and individualized with each individual because they have their own distortions and their own faulty thoughts.
Now, all of this makes sense to me, but I'm wondering if there's any research or evidence to suggest that behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, is a best approach to treating pathological gambling, as opposed to, say, something that's more psychodynamic that would address the reasons why somebody's looking to fill that void or what they're doing. Do you have any information on that?
I do. There's more research out of Canada than there is out of the United States. There's a gentleman by the name of Robert Ladouceur, and he does a lot of research in terms of what treatment works, why it works, and brings really research to the clinical field. He has also written books that help do the treatment that works. So it brings up the behavioral, the cognitive behavioral. There's several other authors and researchers in the United States as well as in Canada. There's not too many journal articles. There's a Journal of Gambling Studies that has a lot that brings research to clinical practice. But it's, again, gambling and pathological gambling is much further behind than substance abuse and co-occurring disorders.
So we can go ahead and put some links to resources for folks on the podcast
Absolutely.
website. Okay, great. So Jody, is there anything else that you'd like to talk about with regards to treatment?
Sure. I'd like to go over some of the difficulties related to treatment. You have an individual that might say there is no such thing as chance. Again, with my other podcast, I go into more depth about chance versus skill. This is a main component of treatment in terms of understanding and treating this population. You need to work to get a definition from the client that involves the unpredictability and the absence of control in understanding chance. If you can't get them to agree to that, go back and look at how motivated they are internally, and they might not just be ready to make the changes that you hope that they could make or that their family wants them to make, and you need to have that discussion with them. Another one is viewing games of chance as games of skill. All the books and magazines reinforce that. On Amazon.com, you can buy hundreds of different books on how to get better at something when really it's more of a game of chance than it is a game of skill. So you want to explore that with the client because they will get stuck on that. When they believe in the idea of control and they won't let go, they believe that they have control over the game in a way that they don't. It's like asking someone to go to controlled drinking when they have actually met criteria for alcohol dependence. They still think that they can control their alcohol. Those are definitely barriers in terms of treating this population, is investigating and understanding this idea of control. Can they control their gambling? Can they do a harm reduction, or do they really need total abstinence?
So you would want to find out if somebody thought that they could control it in the sense that, well, I'm not going to drive to a casino, but I'll pick up a quick pick, a lottery ticket once a week, and that'll be okay.
Some individuals might be able to do that. Others, their gambling will escalate in another outlet to the same intensity, if not more. And that's when you know that they can't do a harm reduction model.
Okay. Is there anything else?
Gamblers like to say that gambling is exciting for them. And when you take away their gambling, everything is going to be boring. It takes a fine art, but you need the client to learn that the anticipated pleasure of gambling never equals the actual pleasure of gambling. And they're really locked into the anticipated pleasure, not the reality. So again, you're going into some of the distortions and addressing them that way. Sometimes clients are tardy, absent, or miss appointments. Depending on the setting with populations that you're used to treating, it might look like they're not motivated. It could easily be that there's a lack of money. As we've talked about before, not all insurance companies will pay for this. It's very difficult to get reimbursement. You do ask your clients to pay. They might be missing or canceling appointments because they don't have the money to pay for that appointment. You want to look and investigate that. And lying during therapy. Sometimes that appears as a difficulty in treatment, but when you really understand this disorder, you almost expect them to lie as part of the pathology, and so that you don't take it personal, or you don't think that there's so you don't take it personal, and you acknowledge it for the part of the disorder that it is. Because
it's actually, is it the only disorder that includes lying as a criteria?
In terms of addictive behaviors, yes.
Okay.
Lack of cooperation can easily be a barrier to treatment or difficulties related to treatment. As we all know, when you have CBT, you do tend to assign homework. If you have not made this clear with your client up front, if you have not given them homework that matches their schedule, their work schedule, their life activities, then they won't come to sessions with homework completed. And so to you that might look like a barrier or that they're not motivated, but you really need to have explored that up front.
And I think just in general about homework, one of the things that seems to be true is that homework is most successful when the client understands how it directly is going to help them achieve their goal. What is it that they're actually going for? And so unless they're clear about their goal, there's no reason to do the homework, especially if it's something even slightly abstract.
That's right.
Yeah.
So it does require you, the clinician, to be very clear and revisit this often, because there is very good homework to assign in the treating pathological gamblers. And so you really don't want to just forego the homework. Depression and suicide. Again, you really need to have assessed this early on and often. Have safety contracts. Acknowledge that this is a very high-risk population and treat them as a high-risk population throughout your practice with them.
I can see, especially with some of the ideas around suicide that have been proposed recently by Thomas Joyner out of Florida State University, that one of the reasons why people become suicidal is because they no longer feel valued by their primary support group. And if somebody's been a pathological gambler and they can maintain the illusion that they will regain that trust. They will regain that place in their primary support group by getting the big win. That once they've let go of that idea that the big win's not going to happen, that they're going to have to deal with those debts, they're going to have to deal with all the pain that they've caused their family, their primary support group, that it could be overwhelming and could lead to thoughts of wanting to die.
You said that really well. Absolutely. Pathological gamblers are the number one population for suicidal thoughts and attempts in all the addictive disorders. Last one I'd like to talk about is financial issues. Family members and support people might want to help, again, bail out the individual because they see that they're engaged in treatment and that now they want to do something nice for them. You really don't want to help them out. Family members are going to ask you if they think they should pay off a debt. You really can't tell anybody what to do, especially if it's their money. However, you need to coach them that relieving the pressure too soon will not sustain behavioral changes, and give them more information and more education about the consequences of lending money or paying off debt. You want the pressure to be there. That's the only way that they will make better choices. In any population that you treat, there's difficulties, but sometimes when you know them up front, it makes it a little bit easier to walk into the situation and feel prepared.
Well, Jody, this has been a great overview of crisis intervention, behavior therapy, cognitive behavior therapy, and some of the things to look out for when working with pathological gamblers. So thanks so much.
Thank you.
So I'm Jonathan Singer. Thanks for being with me today for this episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode, visit our website at socialworkpodcast.com. If you have suggestions for future podcasts, please email me at jonathan@socialworkpodcast.com. And to all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you back here next time at the Social Work Podcast.